There's something familiar and universal and intimate about clothing and textiles. In Palestine, that I think is amplified even further. And what's remarkable are the ways in which each dress tells a story of the woman who made it, carries her memories, her personality within it, and can be kind of unpicked and unravelled in order to understand something about her and something about the time in which she lived. My name is Rachel Dedman. I'm the curator of Material Power Palestinian Embroidery at Kettle's Yard. In 2013, I was invited by the then director of the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit to curate an exhibition for them on Palestinian embroidery. And this began more than a decade of work and a passion for embroidery that took me all over the Middle East, travelling across Jordan and Lebanon and Palestine itself, meeting people who worked with embroidery, who collected embroidery. People threw open their homes, their wardrobes, their trunks full of extraordinary dresses, and shared with me their knowledge in that process. I met academics too and visited museums and institutions, but so much of that research work was done via word of mouth and through the kind of oral tradition in which much of Palestinian embroidery and its knowledge exists and is contained. And so that process of research took the form of two exhibitions, one in Beirut and one in Palestine itself. And that latter show in 2018 was called Labour of Love. And Andrew Nairn, the director of Kettle's Yard, saw that show and fell in love really with the richness and extraordinary beauty of Palestinian embroidered dress, and then invited me to curate an evolved version of that project here in Cambridge. Material Power really hopes to map out and engage with more than a century of Palestinian material culture. Embroidery in Palestine is truly its most important, rich, fascinating living tradition, perhaps the cultural material with which the country is kind of most closely associated. And the exhibition delves both into that historical life and takes the story through the 20th century and up into the present. So we look at the ways in which women, who were the primary makers of Palestinian embroidery, were stitching these extraordinary garments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the ways in which their clothing were connected to their personality, their character, where they lived. It's a tradition that is remarkable for its regional variation. Every town, every individual village even, has specific motifs, patterns and designs associated with it. And embroidery in that historical tradition was really a language that other women could read and sort of partake in. And so there's so much of that story to be told and unfolded through the historical dresses that we have brought from the Middle East to Cambridge. But we also then dive into some of the more complex dynamics that were at play, both then in terms of colonial history in Palestine, the British Mandate period from 1918 to 1948, and the effects of the Nakba in 1948, which was this sort of real watershed moment when Palestinians were displaced from their homes. Many were killed in that war and subsequent sort of forced migration. And embroidery, of course, transformed and changed with it. You had embroidery taking on new forms in camps, becoming this tool of resistance, being politicised in the service of national struggle and becoming this key symbol for the nation. This is where we look at posters and paintings and the way artists were involved in telling that different story. Today we explore how embroidery has become part of a global economy, made in totally different circumstances as a commodity and so on. And finally we bring in contemporary artists and we look at the ways in which artists from Palestine, but equally the broader Middle East, are engaging with embroidery as an instrument for contemporary critique and engagement with some of these ideas, both historical and new. One of the most remarkable and special objects in the exhibition is what we've been calling the Nakba dress. And this is the first thing you see when you walk into Gallery 2. It's an older dress, was made maybe in the 1930s, and it looks like it's from the Ramallah area. It's got red embroidery on sort of the raw beige linen colour that was typical of this area. Classic Ramallah style embroidery. But it transformed after 1948 because it was donated by the woman who originally made it to another woman who walked into the West Bank, forced from her home during the Nakba, wearing perhaps, or carrying with her perhaps nothing more than the clothes on her back. And the Ramallah woman gave her one of her spare dresses so that she had another. But the woman who inherited it has enlarged it using material from a bag of flour that was issued to refugees by UNRWA, the UN Refugee Works Agency, in the sort of immediate aftermath of 1948. And we know this because you can still see the blue, the sort of the end of the UN blue letter, the Arabic letter Nun, from the word tahin, or flour, that would have been stamped on the side of it. So the very materiality of that dress tells us about the urgency of the situation, but also reflects the generosity of women, one to another, at this extremely difficult time in their lives, and the sheer resilience of women also at that moment. So one key story in the exhibition is, of course, the ways in which embroidery has become this tool of resistance in Palestine. And that manifests in a lot of ways, but one of the most fascinating is in the form of intifada dresses, named for the first intifada, which lasted roughly from 1987 to 1993. Intifada means uprising in Arabic. It was this moment of really collective resistance and uprising against the Israeli occupation in the late 80s. It was a period where Palestinian colours were banned from being shown in public. Palestinian flags would be confiscated from people at protests. And so women started to stitch symbols of resistance onto their dresses. Embroidery became a space where that resistance could be made public. And so what you see is, on the one hand, the same traditional motifs you see on dresses 100 years older, but now done in the colours of the Palestinian flag, red and green, black and white. And this whole new vocabulary of motifs. Doves sort of soaring across a chest panel with rifles in their claws, or the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, these sort of key architectural sites, the ship of return sailing along the hem in a way that hasn't been seen before. Fascinating, amazing objects. And what I love about them is that they're not what you might think of when we think about protest. When we go to a march or a protest today, we make things that are spontaneous, usually, done quickly. We scroll a sign, or we print off a poster, or we graffiti something, I don't know, things are fast. And anyone who's ever embroidered will know that embroidery is really slow, very laboured, it's physical work. During the Intifada, it would have been made under very difficult circumstances, stitched in secret. You couldn't be seen to be buying certain colours of thread. You might be doing it at home without electricity, by candlelight at night, and it would have taken years to make these dresses. So they embody for me this notion that resistance is not an event, it's a process. It's something ongoing. And there's a word in Arabic that's very important for Palestine, which is sumud, or steadfastness. That's how it translates. And the dresses embody that sumud, that idea of staying with the struggle. And embroidery in its long form, the amount of time it takes, embodying that so beautifully. It's really important to us that contemporary artists are part of this exhibition and part of the conversation, because for artists both from Palestine who are engaging with this specific tradition or this legacy of theirs, and for those from elsewhere in the Middle East, they have an important perspective, a voice, and a way of looking at this material that then helps us think differently about these historic pieces. So we're trying really to forge a dialogue between the historic material and contemporary artists' practices. Palestinian embroidery remains absolutely vital for Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the global diaspora. As a craft, as a symbol of nationhood, as one of those cultural materials that feels totally indicative of home, it's of absolute importance. And there are people all over the world devoted to preserving it, to continuing to practice it, to spread the word about it, and to keep that tradition alive, given the turbulent nature of Palestinian sovereignty and the sort of difficulty of continuing to live under occupation as Palestinians are. It was recently added, Palestinian embroidery was, to the UNESCO list of intangible world heritage as a practice that deserves to be remembered and preserved and continued. And I think that has only served to cement and confirm how fundamental it remains as a symbol of identity for Palestinians the world over.